Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Denis Maximov. I'm Curator of Art and Programs here in the Pushkin House. Welcome to all of you returning and new guests. We hope you'll come back again. And today it's my pleasure to introduce John Lough, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. He studied German and Russian at Cambridge University, and began his career in Soviet studies and in conflict studies further at Research Center focusing on Soviet and Russian security policy. He worked at NATO as well and gained direct experience as well of the engagement with the Russian authorities as well in Russian business across both the experience of dealing with businessmen and dealing with in diplomatic agenda as well. And he's also author of Germany's Russia Problem that was published by Manchester University Press in 2021. And today we'll speak to John about the question of German-Russian relations, their genealogy, their current condition, and we'll also touch upon the mysterious question of the future in that sense, that both relate to Germany and the European Union. So please give a round of applause to John. So we'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'll open up the floor to a conversation with you as well. So my first question to John would be actually, what was that reason that brought you into that space as a British person who got interested in the Germany and Russia and their dialogue across the centuries of history?
Okay, Denis, good evening, everyone, and thank you for to Pushkin House for the kind invitation. I'll try and give you the short answer to that question because it's a little bit complicated. But my dad was a very good linguist, taught languages in a secondary school. And one of his main languages was German, and I was actually a late child in my parents' lives, and my dad had, as a young man learning German, he'd spent time in Nazi Germany, and it's something that made a very deep impression on him, and he used to describe these things to me, and I must say as a small child I found it absolutely fascinating. And he'd also been to the Soviet Union in 1958. And I remember him telling me that he was just amazed to hear people speaking German in Leningrad. Just couldn't understand how Germans could be, dare to be present. And this sort of just opened something in my mind. I was very keen on languages at school. I didn't start learning Russian until I got to university. But I was aware that there was something between Germany and Russia that was very different and very special, really from a relatively early age. And I had a sort of remarkable discovery when I was at Cambridge, and a lady I think who's well known to Pushkin House, Irina Kirillova, who taught me the famous Dostoevsky paper at Cambridge. She set us a really horrible essay on biesi, the devils, and she was interested always in the psychopathology of the main character Stavrogin. And I was probably like everybody else, I was struggling with this. And so what do students do in these situations? They go to the university library and they see if there's anything useful written on the subject that they can probably incorporate into their thinking. And so I had a look round, and initially I couldn't find very much. And then I thought, why don't I look and see if there are any German sources? And I discovered some things that were really extremely useful and were then incorporated into the essay I wrote. And Irina Kirillova asked me, where does this come from? And I said, well, I discovered these German sources. And she said to me that you have found something very important and you need to keep on looking into those sources because this relationship is, she was not a German speaker. And I remember her saying to me, I envy you being able to do this. So, please carry on. So I sort of feel as though I've been carrying on ever since then, because I had the amazing opportunity when I worked for NATO in Russia in the 1990s. I started there almost 30 years ago, which is a rather horrifying thought. But because NATO didn't have its own premises, I spent 1 year at the French embassy, and I spent 2 years at the German embassy. and being able to watch the German diplomats interacting with Russia in ways that were so different from their British counterparts or indeed French counterparts was a very important lesson for me. So really things went from there. I sort of felt I had a measure as an outsider of how the two cultures interacted, and I could particularly see what the Germans were trying to do in order to build relations in Russia, and they were extremely energetic at doing this. The German embassy at the time was the biggest embassy in the world they had, and they were able to establish contacts in all spheres of life, be it from business right through to sport, and enormous exchange programs occurring between Germany and Russia at all levels. This was a really busy embassy. And for me, that was, again, just an important lesson of how intense the relationship was and how Germany was doing everything to reinforce it, because it realized there was a kind of window of opportunity, and that window at some point might close. But the idea was you would invest in those relations, and then you could hopefully stabilize things in case something went wrong. So that's my, long answer to your first question.
And that special relationship also has quite a noticeable linguistic footprint in terms of how the German language or German people are referred to in Russian language, nemetz and nemetsky, which is also subject of the artistic research of the current exhibition that you are finding yourself in by Arsen Zhilyaev. And now we'll wear also my classical hat a little bit, because basically nemetz, for those of you who do not speak Russian, means someone who cannot speak, or someone silent, basically, someone barbarian almost in that sense. And it was used in medieval periods to refer not only to Germans, but just in general to the foreigners who were not able to speak proper language, basically. And you could again compare it to the ancient Greek notion of varvaros, or barbarian in a way, but somehow within the ancient Greek and Koine Greek, this varvaros or barbarian did not really stick to any particular nationality or particular culture in a sense. But somehow within the Russian case, that arrived to the point that Germans became this ultimate other at the same time, as you would say. And on that note, I just want to ask you maybe, and again, it's a big ask, but to somehow run us through the maybe 5 last centuries of German-Russian relations up to until the formation of Russian Federation in 1991.
Okay, well that's quite a daunting task, Denis. But you're just on the linguistic point. Of course, you're absolutely right about this word nemoj, which I would probably translate as dumb. That is incorporated, in fact, into several Eastern Slavonic languages. So why did it stick on the Germans? We don't really know. But just as a little aside, because it was one thing that fascinated me at university, was the word Welsh in English. If you go back into Old High German, it's again the same thing. It describes a foreigner. So if a German is describing something that makes absolutely no sense, gobbledygook, there's a word they still use today, Kauderwelsch. So yeah, that's how I guess languages develop. So if I was try to summarize the turbulent history between Germany and Russia over many centuries, I think you have to point to centuries of very fruitful interaction between Germans and Russians, which can be traced back quite easily to the 16th century, to the time of even Boris Godunov. I think those were sort of the first time when Germans were recorded as being in Russia. I remember in my book coming across the important fact that it was a German engineer who helped blow up the besieged fortress in Kazan under Ivan the Terrible. And the really sort of significant influx of Germans came in the days of Peter the Great. And then another wave under Catherine, But during Peter's reign, you had the German suburb already in Moscow, and that was where you had German craftsmen of all descriptions, German engineers, and during the reign of Catherine, there was a big call, and of course a German princess herself, even though she didn't want to sort of recognize the fact so much that she was German or show favoritism towards Germans. But she did encourage quite significant immigration into the Russian lands, and in particular into agriculture, where Germans were very successful, and in the Ukrainian lands built actually quite a strong position for themselves, which was right up to the revolution. The other, really major difference was the incorporation of the Baltic Germans into the Russian bureaucracy, again a process over several centuries. So these were the Baltic Germans, I guess, were the original, came from the Teutonic tribe who established themselves in lands that then later became Prussia. But these people tended to be very well educated, and they were willing recruits for the Russian administration. And I think it has to be remembered that Germany has played such an enormous role in shaping the administrative system in Russia, the education system, the military system. It's watching the 9th of May parade and the goose stepping. You got to remember where this comes from. This is the German influence. And rather paradoxically, if you think of the German helmet particularly became the pickaxe helmet that became well known during the First World War, that was actually an import from Russia. So there was this again as an example of this kind of interaction between Germans and Russians. So then in the area of the arts, of literature, philosophy, music, tremendous influence of Germany. And that's, again, carried on right through the centuries. And interestingly, not even long after the defeat of Germany in the Second World War, the German author Heinrich Böll was, in the late 1950s, was very popular in Russia, in the Soviet Union. So we tend, I think, to look heavily at the history of German-Russian relations through the prism of the tragedies of the 20th century. This was not the norm. This was something truly exceptional, and the fact that both countries in the first half of the 20th century found themselves, I suppose, imprisoned by certain ideas that then drove them against each other. And this was in so many ways counterintuitive. But I suppose the warning of the potential danger of things going wrong between Germans and Russians, and this was after, of course, the unification of the German lands in 1871. Bismarck, in fact, was a Russian speaker. He served in Russia as ambassador, if my memory tells me correctly, and one of his tasks, directed by the Kaiser, was to find out whether Russia could in fact be a reliable ally. And he was somebody actually who was very pessimistic about the stability of Russia at the time. But he sort of bred in Germans this idea that you must be cautious about Russia, mustn't treat Russia harshly because it could come back and bite you. But interestingly, he was somebody who actually later imposed quite severe banking sanctions on Russia at one point. It was a complicated moment in history, so maybe he wasn't entirely consistent in his behavior. But if you look at the 20th century, then, of course, the dominant event is World War II, and how this sort of diabolical attraction between Hitler and Stalin led to them, I think, fatally underestimating the other. And I mean, it's extraordinary to think that in May 1941, just a month and a half before Hitler's forces invaded the Soviet Union, you had Germans participating in there was a May Day parade. So all the images are there. We'd had the carve up of Poland by Germany and the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So there is some absolutely just amazing history around that, about how Stalin and Hitler read each other, and what then went so tragically wrong. And then, of course, the violence of the war. And it was said to me by one of my first bosses when I worked at the little research center at Sandhurst that the Germans still didn't understand, this was a military historian, how they'd actually been defeated by the Red Army in World War II. Because this was the world's premier army. It was not supposed to be find itself in such terrible trouble in the Soviet Union, let alone be find itself being outmaneuvered by the Red Army, because Soviet military commanders were simply able to fight war better than German generals. So, and that remains one of the most extraordinary human achievements of how the Soviet Union defeated the Red Army and contributed to the defeat of Hitler and the Nazi regime. So, not surprisingly, on the German side, there's still immense sensitivity about that episode, how Germans managed to do this, the horrors that they committed. And I think extraordinarily, and Germans find this very hard to understand, how it was that they were relatively easily somehow forgiven for what they did, or at least the future generations were forgiven. And Germans were able to re-establish relations with Russians. Of course, it took time. It wasn't a uniform process. But if you think through the years of the Cold War, and there's an enormous amount of history to talk about there if you really want to, but the fact that Germany was a divided country, you had 17 million East Germans who experienced the Soviet-style regime, and how that genuinely functioned with an extraordinarily efficient, it has to be said, state security service, of course, modelled on the KGB and its antecedents. It's fair to say that there are still a very large number of Germans who know something about what Soviet citizens experienced. In both positive and negative ways, as they would see it, and it's one of these things we can talk about a little later that explains why Germany is today the way it is politically. But the thought that just occurred to me as trying to sum up sort of the latter half of the 20th century in relations between Germans and Russians, it was the extraordinary impact of Mikhail Gorbachev in Germany, in West Germany, and it was. I suppose a combination of his charm, the moment, the sense that the Cold War might come to an end, that really gave him extraordinary levels of support, and he enjoyed, of course, when the Cold War ended, a remarkable status in Germany that he certainly didn't have in his home country, sadly. So Germany lived through that episode of division, of the significant number of Soviet forces, 19 tank-heavy divisions, if I remember correctly, stationed on East German territory. It lived through the Berlin crisis, when we managed to get through all those things. And then this extraordinary moment when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and Soviet forces were withdrawn from Germany, and they were in fact withdrawn ahead of schedule. I think that's actually one of the remarkable things about the way the Soviet authorities at the time dealt with this retreat from Europe. And to get the Soviet forces out of East Germany required actually interfering with the railway system in such a way that made it very difficult to bring in the harvest. So they sort of people forget these things, that yes, the Soviet soldiers had to leave, and by this stage, of course, they were Russian soldiers. But enormous efforts were made on the part of the Soviet authorities initially, and then by the Yeltsin government to ensure that took place. The period after, maybe, Denis, we can talk about, but that would be my sort of little summary, that we forget how much positive collaboration, interaction, and I think mutual interest there was on both sides. So I always think, talking to Germans, one of the things they admire about Russia is the spontaneity of Russians, if I'm trying to generalize, and the fact that Russia is not organized in the way Germany is, that people can afford to be more creative in this environment, what Germans perceive as probably a rather chaotic environment. And yet, on the other hand, in Russia, you very often encounter this sort of admiration for, of course, German lovers of organization, Germans' engineering prowess, and there was no, I suppose, coincidence that the structure of trade between Germany and Russia really didn't change greatly for some centuries after industrialization in Germany, because Germany exported machinery to Russia and imported raw materials. And you could see that going on, in fact, up until 2022. So that's a tradition that's really remained there.
I think you brilliantly handled a very complicated and large question of this genealogy. But coming to the tail end of that story, somewhat you could say maybe that Russia and Germany comparatively found themselves in the 90s in the similar situation. It was newly formed two states, basically. They were unified Germany and the just founded Russian Federation. I always make a joke about my own passport, my own Russian passport, that I was born in 1987, and my passport says that I was born in Russian Federation, although technically Russian Federation was not even conceived at that particular moment. But that sort of idea, I think, of a split, let's say, of identity, is also very, as you also highlighted, is familiar to Germans as the experience of living under the specific type of political regime. And turning into that first decade of existence of those two new states, the reunified Germany, and especially also reunified Germany after the Jacques Delors foundation of the Four Freedoms and that beautiful pathway to the European Union we know now, and the Yeltsin Russia. So how those relationships were formed, basically, and if we could just arrive up to until the Putinist Russia, basically. Mm.
Well, let's maybe start with the relationship between Boris Yeltsin and Helmut Kohl. It was a very warm, personal relationship. Helmut Kohl's wife struggled with it because as a small girl, she had been raped by a Red Army soldier and thrown out of a window that left her with lasting spinal injuries. And I think she struggled with the idea of her husband being friendly with the Russian president. But it seems that Kohl was not just able to see this extraordinary opportunity to reunify Germany at speed, he understood the bigger picture and the need to find a way to integrate Russia into Europe. And it's something that President Putin has talked about repeatedly, is being at present at a meeting with his boss at the time, Anatoly Sobchak, the mayor of St. Petersburg, with Kohl. And Kohl outlined this vision that I see Russia as being a part of Europe that we have to integrate, that we are together, and it's something that's clearly made a deep impression on Putin. I think during those years, Germans saw, of course, the immense opportunities if there was a way of keeping Russia stable, of keeping it on this track, pro-European, indeed pro-Western track, that somehow Russia would find its feet and reform itself, and it would shed its Soviet past. But meanwhile, they were dealing with East Germany and finding how extraordinarily difficult that was. I think this is one of the paradoxes of their idealism at one level about how this change could happen rapidly in Russia when they struggled in East Germany. And partly because they, as far as the economy in East Germany was concerned, that was taken out of state hands and privatized at great speed. And it was very, very harsh medicine for people from those regions. And Germany became very preoccupied with that. And I think probably to some extent became a little bit just tone deaf to the depth of the challenge in Russia when I sort of think about it now, how we've ended up where we are now. But as I mentioned, the German embassy in Moscow was a fine example of the degree to which Germans were investing in relationships in Russia, and you could see evidence of this at many, many levels in German society. There was a lot of contact and in deliberate effort to build personal contacts. Because after World War II, to integrate West Germany into the West, there was huge exchange programs with France, with the United States, and that was something I think that Germany really wanted to replicate as a kind of fast-track way of overcoming this previous alienation from the Cold War. So you have to say that in some respects, those relationships were flourishing. The problem, however, was what some people might call the countries in between. There's a nice word in German for this, zwischen Europa. Poland, the Baltic states, and others, who began to ask the quite logical question about how were they going to make themselves secure, and how were things going to function, how were they going to attract investment, what was the outlook for them. And you think of a country like Poland, which had not been able to trust either of its major neighbors over many centuries, following when it was the first carve-off of Poland between Prussia and Russia, what was in the 18th century. So not surprising that the Poles would be sensitive about their security. And this was in fact something that the Germans understood very well. And it's a, excuse me, a sort of little known fact that Germany was the country that initially raised the prospect of enlarging NATO with the Americans. And the Clinton administration was not hugely keen on the idea. And that's why they proposed something called NATO's Partnership for Peace that was unveiled, I think, in 1994. They weren't quite on the enlargement page. And it was the German defense minister at the time, still alive today, Volker Ruhr, who commissioned a study from Rand, and he was the first person to sort of push that. And that immediately, and this would have been, mid-93, sometime like that, it immediately created a kind of shudder in Moscow particularly among those people who I would say had a more traditional outlook in terms of how Russia should build its security. And as a result, we could just see one piece of the jigsaw that was not going to fit. Despite this, relations developed beyond the, of course, economic crisis of Russia in 1998. German companies became more present. The gas relationship that had developed between the Soviet Union and West Germany and Austria in the 1960s developed further. And Germany could see that Russian raw materials were still going to remain very important for the further development of its industry. So I think we saw a period of really sort of blossoming relations when a relatively young German-speaking president was installed in the Kremlin. I remember German diplomats saying to me, "These are the best relations we've had for 100 years. We have problems, but we have such a strong sort of mutual understanding that this relationship is going somewhere." And if you want some evidence of just how warm that relationship was at that time, it's worth watching the footage of President Putin's speech to the German parliament, which would have been 2001 from memory. And that's still widely quoted in Germany. It was, I have to say, a brilliant speech. And Putin's German was good enough to deliver it with conviction. And of course, he was pressing on all the right buttons. And you just look into, as the camera pans around the parliament, you look at the eyes of the MPs. They are captivated. Putin had the meeting out of his hand. And for me, that's one of the, I suppose, amazing stories to look at just how that relationship deteriorated so spectacularly in under 25 years, almost just 20 years. So the good years were there from probably 2000 through to 2005-06. I was listening just last week to Angela Merkel's foreign policy advisor at the time talking about how in 2004 Putin had said that the enlargement of NATO to the Baltic states, Romania and Bulgaria, was not something that Russia liked, but countries had the right to choose their own security arrangements. And the Germans thought, yeah, the Russians understand, and NATO is not a threat, of course, all that sort of thing, and kind of just glossed over it. 3 years later, or 2.5 years later, at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, Putin delivered a speech that was angry, resentful about Russia's treatment by the West, and completely caught the Germans and the other members of the audience off guard. And I'm reliably told that Angela Merkel said, Vladimir is a little bit upset, he's a bit emotional today, I'll go and talk to him. Well, that resentment and frustration with the West, of course, just grew and grew and grew. So there was the first big warning sign that things were not developing well, but the Germans chose, I think, to suppress it in the belief that it would somehow go away. And the countries were developing ever deeper relations. There was more trade and the promise of more trade. And then things really moved on to, 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And Germans, being of a somewhat legalistic mentality, I would say were very offended by this violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And Angela Merkel at the time took really quite a strong position on this by European standards. And she was the one who pushed for the first EU sanctions against Russia. And she said in retrospect she wished they'd been stronger, but it wasn't possible to get consensus within the EU. And so, we ended up then in this, very, I suppose, very different situation. Now, if you want just a little indication of how the Germans had, I think, still sophisticated understanding of Russia, despite missing maybe the bigger picture about how in the Kremlin, this sort of besieged fortress mentality was starting to solidify, how this sense of resentment was breeding a new type of maybe emboldened behavior as Russia became wealthier. But after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, the German Foreign Ministry people asked themselves, where could this happen next? And they had a look at the map and they thought, no, parts of this region that we don't know very well. So they opened a consulate in Ukraine, in the city of Donetsk, which I think showed remarkable foresight. And they had a diplomat based there who did some superb networking and really knew his way around. So the Germans knew a lot about Donetsk and the region when things kicked off in 2014. Angela Merkel had learned Russian at school. She even won some Olympiade, some competition. And as a present, I think as a 13-year-old, she went to the Soviet Union And she's talked about this in her, I think in her memoirs, that it was a really kind of liberating experience for her, because people in the Soviet Union talked about things that were forbidden in East Germany. And I think she was asked the question, would Germany reunify at some point? And she was absolutely terrified by that. It was her first visit to a discotheque. So she, I think, has some feeling for Russia. And when she met with Putin, he would often, she would often, speak German to him, and he would reply in Russian, as far as I understand. And they managed their relations, and it's well known, this story about Putin bringing his Labrador, into the meeting. Well, because Merkel had this, I think, well-advertised fear of, or dislike of dogs, rather. What's less well known is that the first time they met, he gave her a massive toy dog, the type that they could barely get back on the plane. So there was definitely something he was playing out there, although he's tried to deny it subsequently. So I have glossed over the Gerhard Schröder era, and Schröder was somebody from Lower Saxony, from a sort of political grouping of the Social Democrats that's believed to have been under the influence of the Soviet Union for a while. The Soviet Union had certain networks in West Germany, and I can't remember exactly when Schröder first went to the Soviet Union, but he definitely visited. And he was somebody I think was superbly worked on by Putin. Putin understood his ambitions, his motivations, and was able to charm him. And the fact that he was actually recruited by the Russian side to take a job with Nord Stream. Nord Stream, the company that built the first pipeline from Russia to under the Baltic Sea to the North German coast. That was a remarkable feat. And for reasons best known to himself, Gerhard Schröder is now into his 80s, he's remained loyal to Putin and will not criticize him. There was an effort to exclude Schröder from his party, from the Social Democratic Party, to deprive him of his privileges as a former chancellor. So I think the privileges went, but if I remember rightly, the case of the party, he stayed. So he's become a really very, very controversial figure. But I think if we look at just contemporary relations, one of the really striking things is that in the eastern part of Germany, this is where the Alternative for Germany political party now that has 120 seats in parliament, and the left-wing party, Die Linke, so they're on different edges of the political spectrum, they have actually a uniform view when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. And these are parties that, when President Zelensky came to the German parliament, walked out, wouldn't be present, made very harsh statements about Ukraine, about Zelensky personally. And you have to think that these parties have actually been strongly influenced by Moscow. But they seem to represent a stream of thinking in East Germany that feasts on resentment, a sense that East Germans were badly treated by West Germans in the 1990s when those brutal economic changes took place, and that they and Russians somehow have something in common. And I think this is a really sort of interesting linkage. And what's going to be very fascinating in the coming years, Germany has very ambitious plans to rearm. And the plan is that by 2032, in 7 years' time, Germany will be spending 5% of its GDP on defense. And given that it's currently probably hovering around 2%, that is, and given the size of the German economy, that is a massive investment in defense. But the question is whether citizens, German citizens, are going to in fact support this. And the constituency in the east is a very real worry for the new coalition in Berlin, because they think that they have 4 years to stop those people becoming the biggest parliamentary party. So Friedrich Merz famously said, we can cut the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, vote in half. And what happened at the last election? It doubled. So there's some really fascinating undercurrents there. But maybe just finish this section by saying that I still think, despite the horrors of Russia's intervention in Ukraine after 2022, there's still a belief in, I think, on the part of the political class in Germany and more deeply in society, that Germany and Russia have to overcome this alienation, that Europe will only be safe and secure and Germans will feel complete in their identity when Russia is part of Europe. So that sort of German idealism at one level, I think, still remains. And as a German ambassador to Poland said to me a few years ago, the difference between us and the Poles is, between us Germans and the Poles, is that we Germans believe that Russians can change. I think that's quite a revealing statement.
Yeah, indeed. And you already mentioned on the point that there are actually multiple Germanys at the moment within Germany, and that balance between of the Germanys is quite dynamic as well and unpredictable to some extent. So those particular forces of AfD, Die Linke, and those weird, let's say, potential combinations of the forming governing coalition, or essentially turning basically the page on what Germany is now. So now it will sort of gazing into the crystal ball in that sense and trying to understand where this relationship could be in the future. And perhaps maybe you could outline several scenarios of how this situation could look like. Again, looking at what's happening in Germany at the moment politically, and where the war at the moment is.
Well, let's start with the simple scenarios. And one scenario is that the war drags on, and actually that's the one I very much fear. That the two sides are just not going to be able to find sort of sufficient common language now to draw up the document that President Putin discussed yesterday with President Trump, and we just get into a messy situation where the war has to be sort of fought out to a conclusion somehow. I think there is a real likelihood of that. The more optimistic scenario is that the war will subside. I personally don't believe that there will be any peace treaty signed between Russia and Ukraine until Putin actually leaves the Kremlin. But you could still see a effective sort of freezing of the conflict, the cautious rebuilding of contacts between Europe and Russia, the United States being largely disengaged probably by that stage from European security and having its own agenda with Russia. Whether that will really last beyond Trump, who knows? Trump's view of Russia is one that's actually very, very hard to fathom. But clearly the Russian side believes that the US deep state is going to stay, and it's going to be still in let's say at the very least, competitive relationship with the United States. So if we can look beyond, I think, the Putin and his entourage leaving the Kremlin, I am hopeful that Russia will find a way back to Europe, that it will recognize that it's made itself too dependent on China, and that this is a very unnatural posture for Russia. And in fact, not just the technologies for its recovery, because I think we're talking about Russia's recovery rather than renewal in the first instance, but also management models will come more easily from Europe than they will from China, because of because of the European part of Russia's identity. So if that were to happen, Germany would be very well positioned, I think, to not just participate in that process, but to perhaps to accelerate it. So it's hard to imagine that a people as talented as the Germans, given their economic prowess, the size of the country and their population, that they are not going to play a major role in this sort of reshaping of relations in Europe. So I expect them at some point to re-engage with Russia. It doesn't mean it's going to happen in the next 10, 15 or indeed 20 years. It may be beyond that. And I think that still the old pattern of certain Russian raw materials, Germany's machine building exports, all these sort of things, they will lead just to natural economic interaction. But Germans will, I think, display a behavior that one could describe as once bitten, twice shy. They got Russia, for all their knowledge, they misread it fundamentally, or they misread the intentions of the current rulers of Russia. Fundamentally misread them. And they've had to eat some humble pie and accept that the Poles and the Balts were in fact proved right, even if their predictions in the 15 years ago to Germany has sounded hopelessly pessimistic. The president of Latvia at the time, President Adamkus, begged Gerhard Schröder not to go ahead with the Nord Stream pipeline, and he was just almost ridiculed. That how can you make these arguments still about Russia? It's not like that anymore. So the Germans have learned the hard way. But I would anticipate that just because of that, I suppose, volume of history, of cultural relations, economic relations, and a sense of responsibility for the East, that Germany will be back, and Russia will be, I think, hopefully keen to redevelop those relations.
It's a pretty hopeful note to turn to the audience. So there are so many other potential angles that could be addressed, the European Union angle as well, and the Germany's role in still framing Brussels in many ways, and whether it either helps or rather obstructs the possible special relationship and in its further development. But turning to the audience, and we have actually two audiences. We have a live audience and we have also a live stream audience. So you also welcome to ask questions. So any interventions from you, our dear audience?
I do have one question. You spoke about German industry using Russian raw materials. Is that a good development for Russia? Because in some sense, supplying raw materials to a more developed country is a sort of third world thing to do. Was that a uniformly positive thing for Russia to be doing, rather than developing its own industry?
Yeah, I think you can make the argument that Germany's reliance on Russian raw materials simply sustain certain practices in Russia that are associated with those industries, probably contributed to levels of corruption and that sort of thing that were in fact very unhealthy. But countries trade based on what's of value to them, and so did Russia want to make that step beyond just exporting raw materials? Of course it did, and it started making it in the 90s. So it wasn't just, for example, exporting crude oil. It was exporting refined products at scale, and they put a lot of effort in the Russian oil and gas industry to do that. So, was Russia in a position where it might have gone further up the value chain in terms of its industrial development? Absolutely. But because now of this tragedy in Ukraine and the sanctions that have been imposed, those developments have been put back probably at least 20 years, maybe 30 years. So Russia is, I think, in that respect, going to pay a heavy price for the decisions that were made by the current administration, tragically. So where are we going to be in terms of hydrocarbons in 20 years' time or more? Now, that's a big open question. And Russia is actually very rich in renewables, if it wishes to be. It's got a serious problem in terms of climate change. Because of the permafrost territory, some of that's melting, and some of the up in the far north, some of those cities that basically built on stilts are sinking into the ground. So I think we will see, no doubt in Russia itself, major changes in terms of the structure of industry and what its exports become. But I refer to that sort of natural link-up between Germany and Russia because I think it will still be there for some time in terms of that industrial or that pattern of trade. But good point, thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much. You talk about natural political and economic alliances that form between Germany and Russia. How are you convinced, or do you believe that the Russian people will be ready to integrate, will be ready themselves to integrate into European culture and European life, if they got given the chance?
Well, that's probably a question best answered by our Russian colleagues, rather than by somebody like myself from this island, who's far removed from that. My sense, having worked in Russia over many years and observed Russia close up for decades, is that Russia does not want to be isolated from Europe. This is so thoroughly unnatural, and the linkages will reform. And when we saw what happened at the end of the Soviet Union, when people had been so indoctrinated over a long period to distrust people from the West for multiple reasons. But I suppose that cultural and maybe historical driver was still present. And clearly, because I've lost friends in Russia because of the war, this is not a uniform trend. And I think there are far larger numbers of people who do not support the current policies than the Kremlin would suggest. And those forces in society will be the ones that drive that relationship. So it will be that 5 to 10% of society that's active, civil society. And I think we will see that re-emerge in Russia when this nightmare comes to an end.
I'm interested in your reflections of Germans' cultural fascination with Russia, and perhaps also to what extent you think that might play into, or have played into, political action. I think there's a kind of a great admiration for Russian culture, which I think is perhaps greater. I know this is a question to you, greater than other European countries, and to what extent does that kind of affect relationships?
Yeah, I mean that's an extremely good question. I think all relationships between countries are shaped by a variety of factors, be it history, culture, I mean culture in the broadest sense, cuisine, literature, music, philosophy, whatever it is. And when you have two countries that have experienced that closeness to the point where the poet Rilke, for example, a German poet, found extraordinary inspiration in Russia. There was a sculptor that I mentioned in my book, Ernst Barlach, who resurrected his career by going to Russia and became a world-famous sculptor as a result. I mean, his career was just sort of dying. And Thomas Mann, for example, you can start to list lots of these people who were, inspired by their experience of Russia. It's hard to imagine that will sort of simply be forgotten, by future, a future political class in Germany and vice versa in Russia. So how has it shaped thinking? Well, I think you could argue it both ways, because there was also, aside from the sort of positive depiction of Russia and the sense of creativity, inspiration, all these great things, and Russians being so different and enjoying a level of freedom that Germans don't have, there was also juxtaposed to that the depiction of Russians as barbarians, Asiatic, and that's also present to a lesser extent, I would say, in some German literature. The 19th century poet Hebel made a really sort of odious comment, almost racist comment to that point. So you probably got some contradictions there that in the minds of people who are making decisions at sort of higher levels. And the experience, by the way, of the Red Army and its behavior when it invaded and conquered Germany is something that's deep in the German consciousness. So I don't want to sugarcoat that, because it really is present, and there are still books being published on the subject about how Soviet soldiers behaved and how this was condoned by, right up to the level of Stalin. So I will leave it there, but just say that is a factor. But for example, there's an episode that I quote in my book that made a really deep impression on me, was when the German Chancellor, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, traveled to Moscow in 1955 and met with Khrushchev. And this visit actually led to 10,000 prisoners of war German prisoners of war being released and returning to Germany. It was an absolute triumph for Adenauer. But they had a very heated discussion, and something went wrong in the interpretation. And Adenauer, he was somebody who didn't have much experience of Russia. He was from the Rhineland, so from that side of Germany. He was somebody who was probably less sensitive to Russia in certain ways. He ended up screaming at Khrushchev about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and saying, you didn't sign it and I didn't sign it. Why are we having this argument? And apparently, Nikita Khrushchev greatly respected him for this. So it's just sort of interesting sometimes how maybe a level of ignorance perhaps helps. That sometimes the true Adenauer came out, and Khrushchev recognized that. So, there are sort of fascinating moments, because that visit could have gone badly wrong, and maybe 10,000 prisoners of war wouldn't have made it back. But it actually turned out to be something of a triumph for the German Chancellor. So, very very good question. I need to reflect on that more. There is something there.
Who knows what would have happened if Angela Merkel would bring an alligator to the meeting with Putin or something? I mean, that would be a way to repay.
With your insight, and I've been listening to this, and thank you very much, because it's been really very insightful. And although we think we know, we actually don't. But it would be very interesting to hear your comment on the UK-Russia relationship in that sense, because, of course, because, you know, from what I know, you know, the British do admire Russian culture as well. Yeah. And, you know, Chekhov is on, you know, or Tchaikovsky in sort of Russian literature and music, and still there isn't that connection sort of at all. And you can feel even now, you know, when you are, and especially after the war, when we would sort of, you know, cross the channel and we would find ourselves in a different context. So, well, we talked about it in a completely different context, even from the sort of cultural perspective, you know, in terms of, you know, artists still being accepted, etc., no cancellation culture and all of that. So with your insight, it will be interesting. If I know this is not the topic of this conversation, but no, it's just fascinating.
Yelena, let me look at it this way, because I think it's actually, you asked a very relevant question. You've made me think of something I haven't mentioned before. I think the reason why you have a different relationship, and obviously we have degrees of alienation at the moment, but in the case of Germany, what I suppose what makes the relationship different is I think there's been much closer interaction between Germans and Russians over a very, very long period. And just to give you an example of, you know, something that is still alive today, it's the number of East Germans who studied in the Soviet Union, who speak Russian very competently, who know how to get along with Russians, they know which buttons to press, they know the differences, and they know those differences are bridgeable. And I used to occasionally go with a Russian client of mine to Berlin, who, you know, gave public speeches and that sort of thing, and would require interpretation. The absolute delight of being in Berlin was you had fantastic interpreters. I mean, I might say, maybe modestly, it's hard to find interpreters of that level in London. And it's partly because the languages actually translate very well between themselves, because structurally there are similarities. And at the end of the day, it was, you know, Germans helped shape the Russian language and organize it. So there are some structures that just go perfectly from German into Russian and the other way around. So I think there's a level of intimacy there that you don't find in the case of maybe people from Britain and Russia. That's not to say, as you know, that there is admiration for Russian culture. There's deep knowledge in this country also of Russian history. But we've had a colder relationship. People don't think of the Germans as being emotional. They're very emotional and sentimental. And this whole notion of Russkaya dusha, the Russian soul, do you know where that comes from? Anybody know? It comes from Germany. It's an import of cultural romanticism. And there's a sort of extraordinary thing that Germans end up becoming quite sentimental about the Russian soul. Well, you know, it did belong to them. So we Brits don't have that. I think we have this cooler, and sometimes explained to me by Russians, rather slightly arrogant approach to treating Russia. And then we have our maybe, you know, rivalries in terms of empire. I was talking to somebody today that, you know, our special services have a different relationship with their counterparts in Russia from the CIA, for example, in American services. There's kind of rivalry there, but there's also a different tone that the two sides use for each other. But, Yelena, I think this is an important point. The tone in which Russia currently speaks to Germany is very similar to the tone it uses with Britain. And that's the striking example of just the deterioration of this relationship.
Other question? Who was here? Oh, David.
Thank you, John, for all those insights, and thank you for giving us hope at the end, looking to the future. But also thank you for reminding us of the brilliant speech that President Putin gave to the German Bundestag in 2001. One wonders where it all went wrong. And I know this is quite a complex set of factors, but is there one side which bears more responsibility for the deterioration that then ensued? Is it the case? Is it perhaps the case that the US and Western Europe did not show enough respect for Russia and did not treat it seriously enough, and this fed the resentment that maybe justifiably Putin had? It certainly doesn't justify all the things he's done, but was that perhaps a factor that made things go wrong?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. This is an extraordinarily complicated issue, and I've got to take part in a debate actually in a couple of weeks' time about King's College about whether the West provoked Russia after the end of the Cold War, and then we ended up, that's why we ended up where we are. I would explain it, I suppose, perhaps in historical terms, and perhaps the best way to illustrate it is to recall a meeting that I attended with the NATO Secretary General and the Russian Minister of Defense in 1996. In the Russian Defense Minister at the time, his name was Pavel Grachov. He was this broad-shouldered paratrooper who I think was not renowned for his intellect, but he'd been loyal to Yeltsin during the 1991 coup. He was courteous, and he listened patiently as the Secretary General at the time, Javier Solana, outlined what was happening at NATO, what NATO's plans were. It was a perfectly warm and a normal diplomatic exchange. And Solana was talking about the sort of interlocking institutions and how we had the OSCE, NATO, the Council of Europe. I swear to God that Gorbachev had never heard of the Council of Europe. All this sort of thing, and anyway, went through that, and of course NATO's enlargement was already on the agenda. It was under consideration. No firm decision had been taken, but it was being looked at. And Gorbachev responded, and he said, "Well, let me explain to you how we look at things here from Moscow in my job." And he got a bit of paper, and on one side he showed where, I'll try and do it on your side, so where Russia was over here, and then we had NATO, Europe, Western Europe here, and in the middle we had Central Europe. And he said, we want to keep Central Europe as a grey zone, thinking that NATO and Russia would have an interest in this. And that for me was the kind of light bulb moment, and that's when I realized why we were talking about NATO's enlargement, because that was one thing that in NATO in Western Europe we didn't want to repeat, was having these historical grey zones, because we believed they belonged to the past and they were a source of instability and all these things. So our fundamental disagreement with Russia, and the disagreement has just intensified and intensified, has been about Russia's belief that it, as a great power, is entitled to a zone of influence. That it, and this is the imperial model for building security, is you expand your borders to make yourself safer, but in the process of expanding your borders, you obviously consume somebody else's security, but you actually make yourself less secure because you've got more territory to worry about. So we've never been able to get to really, I think, this sort of the bottom of this issue with the Russian side, that the way it wishes to build security is incompatible with the NATO version. And we proved after the end of the Cold War that having the NATO framework, for example, was extremely effective for integrating Germany. You think there were concerns in this country in some circles about what a united Germany would mean for European security, equally in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. And I think at the end of the day, for Russia itself, it was also important to have Germany within this framework, where it, that essentially the German question was resolved. And we know we've now moved on to the Ukraine question. So that's where we find ourselves. So I tend to think that there was actually some inevitability about this, that our different visions were A, unbridgeable, and B, were going to eventually collide in a more serious way. But it's still hard to, I think, comprehend that Vladimir Putin saw value in invading Ukraine the way he did. I mean, I'm speaking here particularly about the full-scale invasion. Because Russia had other opportunities, and I can tell you quite sincerely, when I worked at NATO in the 90s, if Russia had shown a desire to cooperate with NATO, the alliance would have accommodated its every wish. It would have been like stroking a cat, and it just sort of collapsed at your feet and rolled over. NATO was so keen for Russia and other Eastern European countries to do exactly that. But there was something in the Russian system that didn't allow it to engage with NATO that way for fear of legitimizing NATO. And it actually missed a stellar opportunity to influence the West. And instead it resorted to other instruments of influence that we're very, very familiar with these days. But I think that was the most extraordinary opportunity missed. And why that was the case, one could look into that in more detail. But I'm sort of, I suppose, reminded of my experience of dealing with a couple of Russian generals who were seconded to NATO's military headquarters in the south of Belgium at Shape. And they commanded a Russian brigade that was incorporated into the peacekeeping mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And they immediately earned the respect of their NATO colleagues. These were very well managed relations. I think the two sides were comfortable with each other. But those officers, when they went back to Moscow, found their careers came to a shuddering halt, because they had, I think, effectively collaborated with the enemy. So, there was undoubtedly a bit of the Cold War thinking still alive on the Western side. That's undeniable, but it was very much there on the Russian side as well. So that probably explains it.
I think what's maybe quite interesting to think of is the suspicion that I think you also saw in a line of the Russian thinking of raison d'être, of existence of NATO post-collapse of the Soviet Union and the initial origin of NATO as something that meant to be exactly the highlighting the division between the second and the first and the second worlds of different ideologies, and this insistence that NATO still makes sense after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's might be an interesting thought to reflect on as well.
Yeah, for sure. I could understand why it was, let's say, unpleasant for Russians to look at an enlarging North Atlantic alliance. But you had to ask yourself, I think, two questions. A, why was it enlarging? Was this really intended to present a threat to Russia? Well, if you looked at the military structures it was using, NATO was disarming at the same time. So it didn't seriously represent a military threat to Russia. This was much more about, a sense of prestige, maybe, a sense that Russia was not being properly respected as such. But one of the lessons that we learned at the end of the Second World War, and subsequently, was that small countries have a voice and they have to be respected. And famously, Chancellor Helmut Kohl told his defense minister at the end of the, when the Cold War came to an end and Germany was unifying, he said, don't forget to go and brief the Luxembourgers, because they're important. They're one of our neighbors. And this whole idea that Germany had to normalize relations with all its neighbors and manage those relations so carefully. Russia's maybe definition of good neighborliness is a different one, and very much more along the lines of you will respect our interests and you will behave in a certain way. And of course that was always going to create tension with with countries that felt that they had a right, they had won their independence, and that independence had been formally recognised, but somehow wasn't being fully observed. And so you look at the cases of Ukraine and Georgia, then that's absolutely clear. But in my humble estimation, it was a big mistake at the Bucharest NATO summit 2008 to issue a communique saying that Georgia and Ukraine, I quote, will become members of the alliance. And even if that was absolutely clear to everybody in the room, that this was something that, you know, it was a way of kicking the issue into the long grass, then on the Russian side it was just a very, you know, convenient pretext to say that.
Rhetorics and symbols.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe the last two questions.
Thanks for that. If I may, I'd like to engage constructively with your optimism, which I don't share, but there are various reasons for this. I'm speaking to someone who's lived in Germany and in Russia and also worked for the UK Foreign Office, trying to engage the Germans quite a lot on their Russia policy. But you've talked a lot about continuity and the relationship, which you seem to have characterized as sameness to a large degree over a period of time rather than othering. I'm finding it difficult to formulate the question, but it does go to this optimism. One of the issues is this isn't just about Germany and Russia, it's about all the other countries that lay in between them and around Germany, and about Europe as a concept. And when you talk about change and consistency, it seems to me that you seem to have this sense, I might be wrong on this, that there is consistency in, between German and Russian relations, which comes from some aspect of similarities and sameness, if I can put it that way. But the issue is that Europe as a continent and as a concept has changed a great deal, and that has had philosophical and cultural impact on Germany. Germany has driven in that. Whereas I don't see a willingness, not just politically, but socially within Russia, to adapt and accept change on the same way. So when you talk about your optimism for the future, is there a specific basis for this? Are there points in which you can indicate or specify that do give you cause for this optimism for better relations in the future? And thank you.
Okay, thank you for the excellent question. Just because I present possibly a more optimistic view of how things might develop over time between Germany and Russia doesn't mean to imply I think that the short to medium term is going to be anything other than very bumpy and unpleasant. And I continue to think that Russia, for reasons of self-preservation, is going to have to eventually change the model it's used for its own governance for centuries, because this is simply so inefficient. And you look at the the mounting problems facing Russia long term, be it demography, climate change, economic decay, overdependence on China, all these things coming together at the same time, then this country with I think extraordinary capacity to mobilize itself when needed is going to have to mobilize itself again in a very different way, because otherwise a country so large and diverse is actually not going to stay together in the form we know it today. That's looking a long way away ahead. It doesn't mean to say I think the Russian Federation is going to collapse, but in order for the country to stay together, it's going to have to do something, I think, radically different. And that includes looking closely at its own strengths and weaknesses, the way it relates to its neighbors, and thinking simply how is it going to reassert itself as a European country? How is it going to be part of what's forming in Europe? Because Europe's going to be different, let's face it. I think we should be under no illusion that the United States is withdrawing from Europe. And NATO is going to take on a very different significance, I mean, assuming it even continues to exist as a structure. So in that environment, Russia may have important opportunities, but if it doesn't do something radical, then I would worry about its future. So I think that sort of rethink of how Russia's got to where it is, and I'm quite certain that the impact of this war in Ukraine is far greater on Russia than we currently imagine. And there'll be no doubt some reckoning there, and questions asked about why did Russia do this in the first place? What on earth did it gain from doing that? It's absolutely clear that Putin is not going to win this war in the way that he imagined. So let's see where we are when all that starts to come through in the wash. What worries me, however, in the meantime, is the level of indoctrination in Russia throughout the system, and how the country is going to have to find the resources to break free from that. And if you think about some excellent history books that were being written in the 90s, and proper objective treatment of painful issues like the Katyn massacre in Poland, all that sort of thing, it's all been turned on its head. So those revised textbooks are going to need, from the 90s, are going to need to be brought out again in some form. So I don't wish to suggest this is going to be plain sailing, it's not.
And the last question.
You may just want to say that this is off topic, but did Russia have any discernible reaction to the West going into Iraq? Or did they just let it happen and not have much to say?
Well, that's actually a very relevant question. It's not off topic at all, because there was a sort of nascent alliance formed by Putin, Chirac, the French president, and Schröder, who were all opposed to the intervention in Iraq. So, interestingly, Putin had some sort of European allies at that point. I think the Americans were furious about this, that the French and Germans wouldn't go along with it. So, in that respect, at that point, and Putin had strong tactical reasons for doing this, trying to cultivate relations with Europe as a way of weakening the transatlantic link. That was definitely what it was about. He found voices who were prepared to, I think, largely share his views, vice versa. So that may be actually one of the sort of high points of his influence in Europe. He certainly had alignment at that point.
Well, thank you so much, John. Please give a round of applause. And feel free to stay longer. We have a bar open right now, mingle and chat more. And also you can ask John some maybe questions if he can stay with us for a bit longer in more informal fashion. Thank you so much, and come again. Check our programs. We have a lot of things coming up in these 2 months.